Before we begin video 36, on the historical fulfillment of Revelation chapter 11, verses 14 through 19. First, this is a special grand finale video, on Revelation chapter 11. It is a very long video which actually combines two videos, into a single special 2-hour-long presentation, to wrap up the end of Revelation 11. Because of its length, you may wish to break up your viewing of the video into 2 or more sessions, or plan on taking a break halfway through the video. Often movie lengths are about 2 hours long, so this video is within that range. So, you might want to make yourself a nice bowl of popcorn, and find a very comfortable seat, before you get started. Also, you may notice on the historical timeline, the time frame marker for 1946, will also sometimes be shown as 1947. As well as 1975, will sometimes show up as 1976. The variation in those dates are the result of the fact that some dates were taken from an Excel spreadsheet, and some were taken from a running calculator. Because of the way the two devices truncated the decimal point values differently, it occasionally created this variation. But those are approximation dates, and they do not affect the identification of events for those years. So do not be concerned. The other dates are static, and will remain the same throughout. We hope you enjoy this final video for Revelation chapter 11, which spanned from video 23, to this video, which is the 36th installment of this series. Which means by the time you are finished watching this video, you will have viewed over 15 hours of instruction, on Revelation chapter 11 alone. That is more instruction time, than is given in most seminary courses on the subject. And if you have watched all 14 videos, you have also learned why, what they are now being taught in some of our most famous evangelical seminaries today, is completely false, disinformation. And now without further ado, the historical fulfillment of Revelation chapter 11, verses 14 through 19.
There is no Antichrist. Okay. There are Antichrists, but there is no single Antichrist. There is no Antichrist until after the rapture. Okay. There is no. Okay. I work for the Antichrist.
This video covers the historical fulfillment of Revelation chapter 11, verses 14 to the end of the chapter, through verse 19. In the previous video, you saw how John began and ended Revelation chapter 11, with the loss of Jerusalem to the Gentiles, in verses 1 and 2, and then ends the chapter, with Jerusalem returning to the Jews in verse 15. Coming full circle in history. The phrase, the wrong side of history, has become a political battleground between conservatives and progressives in the United States. Progressives like to point out that conservatives have been, quote, on the wrong side of history, throughout most of history. While conservatives like to point out that it is a subjective appeal to populism, because it appeals to what someone thinks is going to be a future majority opinion in opinion polls, and since no one knows what the future will actually become, it has no meaning. Both have a point to a certain degree. But when we begin to look into prophetic information from the scripture, we discover there really is a right and a wrong side of history, and some do in fact know what it is going to be, because God has told them. The evidence of that fact becomes clear when you begin to see how these prophecies are fulfilled in history. And then you discover there really is a right and wrong side of history. If you have been watching the videos in this series on Revelation, you have seen that the Counter-Reformation cannot accurately interpret the book of Revelation. And you might be wondering, how do they manage to get everything so wrong in this book? There are 5 major reasons why a Counter-Reformationist minister can never teach what is in the book of Revelation. The first reason is that they were never trying to teach what was in the book to begin with. The Jesuit theologians who came up with their nonsense was trying to find a theological cover for the Roman Catholic Pope, in view of the emerging theology of the Reformation, which had accurately identified the papacy as the prophesied Antichrist. They weren't looking for accuracy. They were looking for excuses. And what they came up with was the very best that the brightest theological minds of the Roman Empire could find. And you see how comically wrong it is when you compare it with the actual texts. But that was honestly, literally, the very best they could do. They had an impossible task to begin with, so it is understandable they came up with a shoddy explanation. The second reason Counter-Reformationist ministers cannot teach the book of Revelation is that Counter-Reformation theology itself is based entirely on the premise of replacement theology in all of its interpretations throughout the whole Bible. They inherited this delusion straight from the Nicolaitans themselves, as John records in Revelation chapter 2 and 3, where he compares them to Jezebel and Balaam. The result of that dishonesty is that they take all of the texts of Scripture out of their real historical context, and through an act of brazen megalomaniacal narcissism, arbitrarily interpret every single text as though it were speaking exclusively and directly to themselves. No matter how personally anti-Semitic they just happen to be. Despite the fact the texts were written by Jews, about Jews, and to Jews who were either properly keeping or forsaking their Judaism. Not a single word of it was written about Roman Catholics, or Presbyterians, or Baptists, or Pentecostals, or Jehovah's Witnesses, or Mormons, or fill in the blank. Because of the fact they refuse to look at these texts through the prism of apostolic Judaism, which is what produced them, they cannot actually see what they are reading. They do this because they are the theological descendants of the Nicolaitans, rather than of the New Testament apostles, as they claim to the world. And this is a fact that they cannot admit to themselves, or anyone else, without going out of business. The third mistake they make in Revelation, because of their hoax theology, is to employ circular reasoning in their interpretation. Since they begin with the assumption that their theology is true, and no matter what they see, everything in them must be filtered through their theology first. They presuppositionally apply every prophecy in the book to an arbitrary, make-believe, 7-year tribulation period at the end of the world. It seems like a crazy way to read Revelation, but it is the only safe way to get the Pope out of danger of being identified as the Antichrist. They just take it completely out of real history, in order to avoid indicting the papacy on the charges. It is the Antichrist, prophesied in the scriptures. The only problem is, of course, it is as they constructed it, purely make-believe. The language of the texts do not support that claim. So it is like building a tall building on a crooked foundation. And like a crooked building, it has to be continually and forever propped up by its supporters, otherwise the whole thing falls on its own weight. And the fourth reason they cannot correctly interpret Revelation is that a good chunk of the book itself condemns what they are attempting to do in history, including their promotion of Christmas, which the book of Revelation clearly defines as the worship of the image of the beast, as you just saw in verses 7 and 11, and in chapter 10, and in chapter 9. And you just saw previously, John clearly references it as the season of the dead, and his prophecy concerning the seventh trumpet, in verse 18. We will touch on a few more translation points from the grammar, to finish the final touches on our textual reconstruction. Then we will go through these 5 verses and John's astronomically dated timeline, to show its fulfillment in real history. We are now going to look at each of these 5 verses, and make some quick observations on how the content of each verse relates to prophetic fulfillment in history. We will begin this quick overview with verse 15. In the previous video we did a textual reconstruction of these 5 verses. In verse 15, we followed the King James translation's structure of the verse as closely as possible, which rendered the verse as follows: "And the 7th messenger sounded, and there were great sounds in the sky, saying, The royalty of this order are become of our Lord and of his anointed. And he shall rule from ages to ages." That however left us with a very cumbersome sentence in English. If we clean the reading of that text up into a smoother English reading, this is what it would sound like in English. Instead of reading, quote, "saying the royalty of this order are become of our Lord," which makes absolutely no sense in English, that phrase would be collapsed into, saying, "come into being, the royal order of our Lord." Now the text makes sense, and actually better expresses the Greek. "And the 7th messenger sounded. And there were great sounds in the sky saying, Come into being, the royal order of our Lord and his anointed. And he shall rule from ages to ages." If you said in modern English to someone, "the royalty of this order are become of our Lord," you would sound odd. Because people do not express themselves that way in the English language. But if you said to them, "come into being, the royal order of our Lord," they would know exactly what you were talking about. So we are going to polish that up into more accurate English grammar. The occurrence for this event is identified on John's astronomically dated timeline as the year 1890. This text describes a command issued in heaven, that the royal order of the Messiah be restored back into existence. It both explains what happens, and why God does it. He speaks his word in the form of a command to reality, and he does it because the royal order he is commanding to be restored is that of the Messiah. It is being done because of, and for the purpose of, the Messiah. This will become a very important point in its fulfillment in history, and one that will create a great deal of controversy in the future state of Israel itself, among Jews. The next verse is verse 16, which reads as follows: "And the 24 elders, which sat before God on their seats, fell prostrate, and worshipped God." As you saw in the previous video, although this text is short, it plays a very important function in the 5 verses John has written, because it provides time conversion material for constructing the timeline. And it also provides an astronomical event to date the timeline. The year for this text is 1918. But because it is serving a threefold purpose, while the marker year of 1918 is important, the time conversion and the astronomical event both refer to what is going to happen in verse 18 and 19. So it becomes part of the description of events in verse 19. Verse 17 comes next and reads as follows: "Saying, We give thanks to you, Lord God Pantocrator, El Shaddai, the one who is and the one who was, because you have taken your great power and ruled." This text is marked on John's astronomically dated timeline for the year 1946. And the focus of the prophecy is gratefulness for a ruling that has its origins in the sovereignty of God. This text is dated on John's astronomically dated timeline for 1946 AD. When we get to 1946 on John's actual timeline, we will see what that ruling actually was, that the elders are giving thanks for. Verse 18 reads as follows: "And the Gentiles were angry, and thy wrath is come, and the season of the dead, that they should be judged, and that thou shouldest pay or compensate thy servants the prophets, and the holy Kadeshim them that fear Hashem, small and great, and wrought thoroughly them which wrought thoroughly the land." This text, like verse 17, is actually explaining the reason for what is going to happen in verse 19. But in our equidistant breakdown of John's astronomically dated time frame, it gives us the year 1976. The actual text though is explaining the reason for what is going to happen in verse 19. It also adds the additional description of rotting the land, which with the use of pantakrator, referring to the Hebrew word El Shaddai, in verse 17, tells us that a flood is coming, in verse 19. And we have already covered that the reference to the season of the dead, referred back to verses 7 and 11, described as the greetings of Mary and gift-giving instituted by the beast in his war against the two witnesses, which we now know from history, was the coming of the Protestant Reformation. And we also now know that his institution of the greetings of Mary and gift-giving refer to Christ Mass. Lastly, we get to verse 19, which is what the previous 4 verses have been all leading up to and pointing to. In verse 19, we read, "And the temple of God was opened in the sky, and there was seen in this temple the ark of his testament, and there were lightnings and sounds, and thunderings, storms and an earthquake, and great hail." In verse 19 we are given a grocery list of natural disaster events. John says there will be lightnings, sounds, thunders, and hail. These 4 items are all in the plural. Hail is a plural form, even in the singular. We say hail, not hails, or hailings, because the word hail is a plural expression. So, how can these things be prophetic? Did they not have lightnings and thunders and hail in the ancient world? Of course they did. So why would John even mention them? And do so in the plural form? Remember that the earthquake he is prophesying to come is in the singular form. So he is prophesying one particular singular earthquake. But he is not doing that with lightnings and thunders and hail. Here he is using the plural form, meaning he is saying there is going to be lots of them. More than usual. More than normal. So this is a prophecy that multiple extreme weather events are going to emerge in nature. And then, there will be this earthquake. Now, we are going to look at their fulfillments in actual real history. As we go through the events that fulfill John's prophecies in verses 15 through 19, it is important to understand that if astronomical dating in John's prophecies were simply made up or imaginary, then there is no way all these things could be so accurate and so specific to these Greek texts, which have been in existence for multiple centuries, reaching all the way back into ancient Roman times. As mentioned before, John's dating method uses several different categories of information that all have to line up together on a single timeline, thus ensuring the accurate identification of the precise location on the historical timeline John is prophesying about, so that the prophetic event John is actually describing fits like a key into real history. And to fully appreciate what we find written, we have to remember the historical context in which these things are written. John has been exiled to a Roman prison colony on the island of Patmos. His country has been destroyed. His fellow countrymen are being exterminated en masse. Those not murdered are hauled off to Rome to be executed for entertainment in the Roman circus. Women and children who are spared death are being sold as sex slaves for Roman brothels, and used for slave labor in Roman silver and salt mines where life expectancies were only 3 months at best. Even Gentiles who embrace John's messianic faith are being rounded up, and the government of Rome is in the process of fully eliminating both Israelite Jews and his own messianic community, with phony Roman Nicolaitan assimilationists being sponsored by the Roman government. Everything in John's world looks doomed, destined for utter extinction. The term Christian at this point is simply a Syrian anti-Semitic slur against Messianic Jews. The still future Christian religion hasn't even been invented yet. There are no Muslims in the world. That will not happen until centuries later. And among the Jews, even John's group is only considered a heretical sect, and nothing more. And this is a setting for what would become a prophecy about the future of his faith and his country. A single prophecy, so large and detailed and exhaustive, it fills up 22 entire chapters in a book, and becomes one of the most read and feared books in the entire world, and in the history of humanity. This is our timeline for Revelation 11 verses 15 through 19. But when we begin talking about the fulfillment of that timeline, we actually have to back up to verse 14, which ends the second woe and transitions us into the third woe. Verse 13 ended in 1834 with the earthquake in Jerusalem, when 7,000 people were killed during the siege of Jerusalem. The very next verse pronounces the end of the second woe and the sixth trumpet, and announces the beginning of the third woe and seventh trumpet. The year that is marked on John's astronomically dated timeline is 1862 for the beginning of his next era in prophetic history. The most amazing thing about the prophecy concerning the seventh trumpet is that it covers exactly 170 years, which is 7 times 24 plus 2. Ironically, we actually even use the phrase 24/7 as an expression to refer to time, or a fullness of time. But what is really amazing about this prophetic time frame is that it divides each of the historic markers along this time frame by exactly 28.3 years. And amazingly, 28.3 days is exactly the average value of the lunar month that was used in the Jewish calendar. There are 6 points of reference on this prophetic timeline, reflecting the 6 days of creation, divided by exactly 28.3 years, and amazingly, as you will soon see, each of these points, divided by exactly 28.3 years, hits every major event in Western civilization that occur in those 170 years. And especially, in reference to the events that lead to the restoration of the State of Israel. What are the odds of that all actually randomly happening and fitting the exact description of every event described in each of the texts? But as you are about to see, each event, exactly 28.3 years apart, will fit with the precision of a master key that will literally unlock God's divine design in human history. As you know from the previous videos, Revelation chapter 11 is the story of God's retributions against the kingdom of the beast for killing the 2 witnesses, and then memorializing their defeat in the institution of the greetings of Mary and the giving of gifts. Stated in verses 7 and 11. As you now know from history, that was the coming of the Reformation, begun by the 2 witnesses of Luther and Calvin, and the war the papacy waged against them through its counter-reformation. In verse 13, the counter-reformation and the papacy had control over Jerusalem through the Ottoman Turk Empire, which recognized the Eastern Orthodox Catholic alliance created during the counter-reformation against the influence of the Eastern Orthodox Patriarch Cyrus Licarius, leading the refusal of burials in the city of Jerusalem after the burnings of the witnesses in sackcloth. What begins to be described in the 7th trumpet judgment in Revelation chapter 11 beginning with verse 14 through 19, is the final defeat of the Papal Empire, called the Beast, and its forced return of Jerusalem, back to the Jews. Going full circle in history from verse 2, when Jerusalem was taken away, to verse 15 when Jerusalem is returned. But between verse 14 and verse 19, a lot of things are going to happen in history. And John is prophesying 6 major events on the historical timeline that will illustrate God's existence and retribution against the papal Antichrist. The first prophetic event in this historical timeline begins with verse 14 and is the official pronunciation of the end of the second woe and the beginning of the third woe. It doesn't say much more than woe. If this text describes the beginning of the 7th trumpet judgment with the coming of the third woe, whatever event it is describing on the historical timeline is simply referred by the word woe. That is Revelation speak for massive casualties of some kind. Something that is woeful. If we take 28.333 years and add it to May 13, 1834, it brings us to September of 1862. What was happening in the world in the month of September of 1862? Well, if you don't know, you simply Google the search phrase, "Whoa, September 1862. That might sound funny, but when you do that, amazingly, this is the page it will produce. If you look down the page, you will notice this description. Google pulls up the description, quote, American Civil War, Battle of Antietam, Union forces defeat Confederate troops at Sharpsburg, Maryland, in the bloodiest day in U.S. history. End quote. What are the odds that this date would land on the very same date as the single bloodiest day ever in the entire history of the United States? But even more curious is, what does this all have to do with the seventh trumpet? The exact precise location of the single event on the historical timeline at the Battle of Antietam, and it being the single bloodiest day in the entire history of the United States ever, is absolutely amazing. Because, entering that very battle, on that very day, the Union soldiers were on that very day singing a brand new battle song. It had been composed by a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln and published in the February edition of the Atlantic Monthly magazine. It became known as the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And this is what the soldiers were actually literally singing when they marched into battle at Antietam. This hymn was actually composed for the very purpose of being sung while Union soldiers were marching into battle. That is why they called it the Battle Hymn of the Republic. It had been published in the very same year, February of 1862. If all this were not amazingly coincidental enough already, it is the lyrics of the song which were coming out of their mouths as they marched and sang. They were literally singing texts from the book of Revelation. Oh, but wait, that's not even the most amazing thing. The texts they were actually, literally, physically singing as they marched into battle at Antietam came from this very text in Revelation chapter 11. It's extremely hard to get anything on earth this specific and literal in a prophecy about the seventh trumpet, that the very date the text gives us lands on the very day literal soldiers are marching into the bloodiest day in their entire national history, before or after, singing out of their own mouths the very words of this very prophecy that prophesied them in history. It doesn't get any more literal and specific than that. And this amazing synchronicity, as you can clearly see, is beyond any realm of human imagination or contrivance. It just cannot be anything other than God. This is the text of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which we will look at in detail. But the history behind this prophetic event, and how it connects to this very text, which is also prophesying them, is absolutely beyond comprehension. And there is no way on earth this could possibly be a simple random coincidence. Because the very next text, in Revelation 11, says that God speaks to reality and commands the royal order of the Messiah to come into existence. And this very historic event will play a critical part of that messianic order emerging in history. And as you can also see, the term woe is extremely appropriate in describing it. Next, we are going to take a look at the words written in the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The Battle Hymn of the Republic is an historical artifact. As such, it also serves as primary source documentation for the period of history we are looking at. The original Battle Hymn of the Republic, published in 1862, had 5 stanzas in it. The first and the fourth stanzas are references to texts in the book of Revelation. The first quote is from Revelation chapter 14. And when you see how Revelation 14 was commonly interpreted by commentators in 1862, the reference to Revelation 14 will become much more telling about what they were singing and who they thought they were fighting. The second reference to the book of Revelation comes in the fourth stanza, and it is a reference to the seventh trumpet judgment, written about in Revelation chapter 11, verses 14 through 19. And how do you know it's a reference to the seventh trumpet? Because there is a small detail mentioned after its reference, as the trumpet that shall never call retreat. All of the other trumpets have declarations that they are past and done. The seventh trumpet, however, has no such declaration. There is no declaration of an end. Thus the description in the song of no retreat. The second detail in the song that identifies it as the seventh trumpet is that the next line in the song was a reference to the judgment seat. And that is how popular theology at the time in history interpreted verse 15, where the text in English says he rules forever and ever. That clearly places the song's reference to Revelation chapter 11, verses 14 and 15. The clip you are about to see has the Battle Hymn of the Republic playing in the background and is being performed by the U.S. Army Band. But you will notice that 2 of its stanzas will not be sung. Both the third and fourth stanza will be dropped in its performance. The third stanza refers to the gospel and Christ crushing the head of the serpent, as it was taken from its reference in Genesis. The fourth stanza is the one that mentions the trumpet judgment from our text in Revelation chapter 11. The most popular biblical commentaries of the time will be shown, explaining how they understood the first reference in Revelation 14, and the second reference in Revelation 11. As you will see, not only did they have no conception of a rapture, they had no confusion or ambiguity over how the prophecies concerning the coming of the Antichrist had already been fulfilled in history. And you will also see what these Union soldiers thought they were fighting when they sang that song. As you can see, there was no such thing as a rapture in the minds of Christians during this time in history, and they also had no problem knowing exactly who and what the prophesied Antichrist really was. But if you saw the letters between the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, and Pope Pius IX, you saw their correspondence was extremely friendly. And the Vatican expressed its emotions toward the Confederacy, in the Pope's own words, as excited, pleasure and perfect friendship, and spoke of Jefferson Davis as honorable and illustrious, and his response to his emissary as all suitable welcome. When the truth of the matter was, there was nothing illustrious or honorable at all about what Jefferson Davis was doing. It was shameful and disgusting. And it was so shameful and disgusting, no one in the world, but the Vatican, would have anything to do with the Confederacy. Because the rest of the world had already recognized slavery to be shamefully immoral, and made its practice illegal. There is a huge story behind this development in history which we do not have time to go into in this video. But some of it is touched on in the video on this channel, How Christmas Came to Church. A link to that video is provided in the description section below. Christmas was brought to America through the influence of the Masons in Virginia and Jesuit slave trade in the South. The Jesuits have had a practice of creating virus theologies to create social change that favors acceptance of the papacy. You have already heard about the hoax theology of branch theory, which was propagated in the Church of England, claiming that the Church of England had emerged in history as a co-equal branch of the Catholic Church. As soon as the Jesuits got what they wanted from it, it was admitted to be a hoax. Likewise, among American Protestants, they propagated rapture theology to avoid identification of the papacy as the prophesied Antichrist. It too was later confessed to be a hoax, now that original Protestant Christianity in America has been supplanted. But in order to seduce Southern Protestants into the counter-reformation and justify their profiteering from the slave trade, the Jesuits promoted a theology which emerged from Valladolid, Spain, among Southerners. This channel refers to it as Valladolid Catholicism. It taught that non-whites were the beasts of the field mentioned in Genesis. Thus owning, breeding and selling them was morally justified. This vile theology became the basis for the ideology of the Ku Klux Klan, who went so far as to even adopt the uniforms of the Catholic monks from Valladolid, Spain. Part of the promotion of this theology also involved the worship of the hybridization of the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Catholic Apollo Christ, born on December 25th. Christmas was sold to Southern slave owners as an important institution designed to protect the practice of slavery by pacifying the miseries of being a slave with an annual escape from its burdens, one day a year. As in ancient Rome, appealing to its earlier use as the Saturnalia in the Roman Empire for precisely that purpose. The influence of Valladolid Catholicism on Southern slave owners is illustrated in the fact that it was the slave state of Alabama which became the first state in America to pass compulsory state Christmas law, recognizing Christmas as a legalized, state-sponsored, holy day. And while the Confederacy lost the war, they won what came after. The Union General Ulysses S. Grant became the next President of the United States. Unfortunately, Grant was not only a prior slave owner and a Mason, but a Lutheran, heavily influenced by the German Counter-Reformation. And one of the things he did to spite Protestants who had been singing the battle hymn of the Republic into battle, as they were getting their legs, arms and heads blown off by enemy fire, was to betray those soldiers, violate the U.S. Constitution, and declare Christmas a compulsory federal holiday. This shocking outcome, however, was precisely what the Book of Revelation had prophesied would happen. The next marker on John's astronomically dated timeline, for verse 15, is the year 1890. The text tells us that God speaks a new order into existence, and that it is the royal order of the Messiah. John's prophecy about the return of Jerusalem was not written in a vacuum. The origin of John's prophecy began during his discipleship under Christ, who had prophesied the same exact thing in Luke chapter 21 verse 24, speaking of the Jewish people. Quote, "And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled." End quote. The times of the Gentiles is just a reference to the various ages in which the Gentiles would have control over Jerusalem. So before Israel had even been destroyed by the Romans, Christ prophesied it would be destroyed by the Romans, and in the end, be restored back to the Jews. It was Christ that prophesied that. Not a secret Illuminati cabal of rich Jewish bankers who worship Satan, seeking to secretly control the world. Sorry if that disappoints you. But that is what is written in the New Testament, millennia before there were even banks, or Jewish bankers, in existence. And FYI, Christ was not a Jewish banker. But this prophecy, and its fulfillment, bring up an important topic that must be fully examined as part of our glossary of terms before we can go any farther. And it directly has to do with this very prophecy in verse 15. If you think Zionism is the same as the Synagogue of Satan, and many people do, then prophecies which predict it are predicting the coming of the Synagogue of Satan. But that understanding is the result of some intentional misinformation. So the phrase, the Synagogue of Satan, needs to be explained. Rome is the empire that destroyed Israel and gave Jerusalem away to the Gentiles. And Rome followed up that action with a mass pogrom of genocide that exceeded Hitler. After it supposedly became Christian, which in fact it did not because they actually adopted Nicolaitanism, it continued to incite throughout history a hatred against Jews. Nicolaitanism out of Antioch, Syria, had been anti-Semitic since its beginnings in John's day. And he describes them this way in his references to them, comparing them to Jezebel and Balaam. Both had been notorious enemies of Israel. A list of their action would fill up a whole video on its own. But the worst of what they did after the literal physical human death toll was to propagate a completely fictitious theology, both about themselves and Jews. They redefined Christ as a completely non-Jewish person, in appearance as a Roman. They stripped him of his religion, which was Judaism, virtually gutting the New Testament. They replaced the focus of all prophecy around Rome and its Roman Universalism, Catholic and Latin, religion. And they fostered the claim, all Jews were of the Synagogue of Satan, and to be either subservient or expunged by the Church. And this false theology was spread throughout Europe, and made its way into European Protestantism as well. Much of the Jewish conspiracy theory you see on the internet today is a residual result of their work. And why the valid Catholic theology of the Ku Klux Klan is also so anti-Semitic. An American Jew looks no less Caucasian than an American Baptist or an American Presbyterian. Yet the Ku Klux Klan, with its rabid anti-Semitism, like Hitler, does not care. Because the theology came from Rome. So in our current climate, if you have a prophecy, even if it is from the scriptures, that something is going to happen that involves Jews, it must be a conspiracy, and not the truth. And when the evil Jewish banker conspiracy is brought up, there is one text that these kinds of people will always without fail quote, and that text has a direct connection to this study. That text cites the phrase, the Synagogue of Satan. So we are not going to get past the fulfillment of verse 15 in history, without understanding what that is, and how does it relate to this verse in Revelation chapter 11, verse 15. The phrase is used twice by John, in Revelation chapter 2 verse 9, and in Revelation chapter 3 verse 9. Chapter 2 verse 9 reads as follows. Quote, I know thy works in tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich, and I know the blasphemy of them, which say they are Jews, and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan." End quote. And chapter 3 verse 9 reads as follows. Quote, "Behold, I will make them of the synagogue of Satan, which say they are Jews and are not, but do lie. Behold, I will make them to come and worship before thy feet, and to know that I have loved thee." End quote. So what is the synagogue of Satan? Really? What does that really mean? Does it prove the Jews are a demonic bunch of people that should be exterminated? Is the Roman Catholic Church and its representatives have actually really taught people in history past?
You have reached the law firm of Suamal, DeFranc, and DeBuncas. We are unable to take your call right now, but if you will leave a message stating the reason for your call and a number where you can be reached, we will return your call as soon as possible. Thank you, and have a nice day.
Yes, my message is I called your law firm about last year to ask you about a restraining order against some magic bugs, and y'all treated me like I was crazy or something. Well, then I realized I had been talking to a Jew law firm. My preacher preached on Revelations this year, and at his annual Christmas sermon about the Synagogue of Satan. That's in Revelations chapter 2 and 3, if you want to get saved. Anyways, he talked about how all the Jews are in the Synagogue of Satan and going to get left behind in the rapture because they don't go to church and worship Jesus. And Jesus, when Jesus comes back, he's going to be real mad, and he's going to kill all the Jews. So that's why I was calling. That's when because I realized then that I was talking to one of them Jew law firms, and that's why they didn't know nothing about them magic bugs respecting legal authority in the Bible. So anyway, I got convicted, and I needed to call y'all and witness for Jesus and the rapture like my preacher told me to do in his annual Christmas sermon. Anyway, God bless you, even though you're Jews, and goodbye. And, and by the way, I can't leave you a number because it won't do you any good anyway. By the time you get this message, I'll be disappeared in the rapture, and you'll just get all mad at yourself for not listening to this message that I left you on your answering machine witnessing for Jesus before he comes back and kills y'all. Amen. Okay, so that's all. Remember now, God loves you, and goodbye.
What you are looking at on your screen is obviously a picture of the devil. At least you would think so. But when you pan the view of the picture back, you will notice something amazingly strange about the devil in this picture. He is being given the 10 Commandments. So, it's actually Moses. This is a medieval fresco painting in the Catholic Cathedral of St. Andrews in England. If you think this is a strange, inexplicable aberration, you would be wrong. This is a picture of a sculpture of Moses by the famous artist Klaus Lutter. It is part of a work entitled The Well of Moses. As you can see, he has 2 small goat horns coming out of the top of his head. It is located in what was Dijon, Burgundy, which is part of modern-day France. The year was 1395 AD. But that's not all. If you go to the Vatican, one of the things tourists like to do is see the artwork of world-famous artists that were employed by the Vatican, such as the very famous Michelangelo, who painted the Sistine Chapel. He also sculpted a statue of Moses for the Vatican. And as you can see, Moses is sculpted sitting in a chair, with the same two goat horns emerging from his head. The chair Moses is sitting in was a visual reference to a chair in ancient synagogues, occupied by the leader of a synagogue. It was called the seat of Moses. We will look at this more in detail in a few minutes. But here, you can see the horned Moses sitting in his chair, as sculpted for the Vatican by Michelangelo. When Christians ask for an explanation of these things from the Vatican, as it does with all history, will simply tell them a lie. It is a lie intended to make the Vatican look as good as possible and hide the actual ugliness of their real history. Their answers to everything in history always follow this same simple formula. There is never a confession and a repentance of anything, as the scriptures call it, the fruits of salvation. Because there is no salvation there to bear any of those kinds of fruits. Instead, there is the Antichrist claim that they are infallible and inerrant in all their wicked behaviors throughout all history. No matter how wicked and demonic and deadly it all was. The Vatican will explain that their depictions of the horned devil Moses was simply an honest mistake. Because Jerome accidentally translated a word from Hebrew that referred to a ray of light as the word horn. Oops. Imagine that. Sorry. But as you saw in chapter 9, Jerome was not making mistakes. He was concocting lies. And he was doing so intentionally. Just as when he literally fabricated and fraudulently added an entire sentence to Revelation chapter 9 verse 11. And what he added was a complete lie. If you remember, it was the verse that said in Hebrew his name is Abaddon, and in Greek his name is Apollyon. He added the completely fraudulent addition that his name in Latin was Terminus, which if you recall was not his name in Latin at all. In fact, that claim wasn't even close. It was Apollo in Latin, which Jerome fully knew. The fraudulent addition was an intentional diversionary lie. He knew exactly what his name was in Latin, and Jerome created a lie to hide the Vatican's connection to that verse through Apollo, whom he knew they had assimilated as Christ. And he also knew that terminus referred to the same expression in history later as beyond the pale, a reference to European Jews. It was no accident. Jerome's intentional corruption of the Hebrew word for rays of light into horns was done on purpose, because Vatican theology had claimed to the world the Synagogue of Satan was a reference to the Synagogue of the Jews. And the corruption in the Latin Vulgate simply gave private instruction to its priests, who were the only ones allowed to read the Latin Vulgate. And just in case you are ever actually tempted by one of these liars to believe the lies that the Vatican is telling the world today about the horns of Moses just being an honest accident and not a reference to the Synagogue of Satan, you should also be aware that Rome spent a great deal of time and money on its iconography. And it was extremely deliberate in those images. If you survey the history of the Vatican's iconography throughout the Middle Ages, you will also see clear evidence of something else too, besides the anti-Semitic Synagogue of Satan mythology it was spreading. The other thing it was spreading was its phallic Catholic theology as well. Satan, or the devil, throughout the Middle Ages is depicted not red, as most people today think it would have been. But instead, Satan is actually very consistently depicted as a black man, very frequently in its depictions of the devil. In the Middle Ages, the devil is a black male. This was the historical origin of the psychological archetype of the scary black man that is constantly seen in the colloquial Karen videos frequently posted on the internet. Why did the Vatican do this? That is, beyond simply inheriting the worship of the Caesars bloodline done throughout the Roman Empire prior to the Vatican. If you look at a map of Islam in the early Middle Ages, which was the most serious threat to the Vatican's power of the age, you will discover that the entire African continent below Vatican Rome had been conquered and occupied by the Muslims. The African continent was essentially a Muslim threat. And these African Muslims were not only conquering Europe, but they were spreading their Muslim religion into Europe as well. So the Vatican responded in the very same way it did to Judaism, by creating a theological narrative and an iconography that demonized the Moros Muslims from Africa. They became the Vatican's image for the devil. But in creating that propaganda, they also created a brand new, virulent version of European racism that would be spread throughout the Roman Church for centuries upon centuries to come, and eventually culminated in the literal cannibalism of Central Americans and West Indies natives, the Jesuit slave trade, the British Empire's white supremacy policies, America's Ku Klux Klan and its terrorism and lynchings, and Germany's Nazi Party, Adolf Hitler and the Holocaust. To illustrate how incredibly far the Vatican was willing to corrupt the biblical record with their despicable propaganda, we will look at one well-known example. In Acts chapter 2, there is the narrative about the day of Pentecost, which comes 50 days after Passover. Thus the name Pentecost, Pente, meaning 50. Acts chapter 2 verses 5 through 12, is a very important description of what first-century Judaism looked like. It defines how the New Testament viewed the Jewish faith, and what race and what racial characteristics Jews were described as having. It also references the homeland of a very important Jew who played a prominently tragic role during the crucifixion of Christ. If you will notice in verse 5, speaking of Jerusalem at the time, the text says there were crowds of Jews in Jerusalem. And then it defines how it sees these Jews. It reads, quote, "devout men out of every nation under heaven." That was the New Testament description of what a Jew was. But then if you look down at verses 9 and 10, you will see that the author specifies several in particular. He runs down a list which include Parthians, Medes, Elamites, Cappadocians, Phrygians, Pamphylians, Libyans, Cyrenians, and even Romans. His list includes pretty much everyone, from everywhere, in the known world at the time. So you see that Jewish, in the New Testament, was not considered a race, because several races are mentioned. When the Vatican wanted to extinguish the existence of races, other than Caucasian Europeans, in its theology, it invented the idea of a Jewish race, which not incidentally, was to be European Caucasian as well. But here is what Jews look like, even today. On your screen are pictures of Jews, from many places in the world, similar to the idea in the book of Acts. You see a picture of Chinese Jews, African Jews, an Arab Jew, Mexican Jews, English Jews and an Indonesian Jew. The Chinese Jew looks Chinese, the African Jews look African, the Arab Jew looks Arab, the Mexican Jews look Mexican, etc. In other words, they look precisely like the people from where they originate. Why? Because Jewish is a religion, not a race. Jews are people who are worshippers of Yahweh. One of the countries mentioned in the text, in Acts chapter 2, is the country of Libya. Here is a picture of a Libyan Jew. As you can see, he looks like a Libyan, from Africa. One of the other countries mentioned is the country of Cyrene. It too, was located in North Africa, very close to Libya. The people from Cyrene were black, like Ethiopians. During the crucifixion of Christ, a Jewish bystander in town for the Passover celebration was forced to carry Christ's cross when Christ collapsed because of exhaustion. His name was Simon, the Cyrenian. He was from North Africa. He was black. But it wasn't until the latter Middle Ages, when the Reformation began approaching, and priests were reading the Gutenberg Bible, that they realized Simon the Cyrene was actually a black man, from Africa. Before then, he had always been painted white. On your screen is the contrast between what actually happened as reported in the biblical record, and how the Vatican flipped the script on history. To your left is the scene in the movie production of the greatest story ever told, of Simon the Cyrenian carrying the cross of Christ. The black actor in that scene is the young Sidney Poitier. As you can see, even Hollywood got the story right. But on your right is how the Vatican communicated that very same scene through its iconography. Instead of a black man carrying the cross for Christ, there is a black man beating Christ with a club. In contrast, not incidentally, a very white Christ with blonde hair. A completely opposite visual depiction of what really happened. And this picture was embroidered on a orphry, which is a garment to be worn by a priest during Mass. It is dated to the early 1300s. You see how completely opposite to the truth the Vatican's narratives and iconography really were. It was in fact a complete opposite of the truth. Are we also to believe this too was simply an honest accident? Was the centuries of depicting Satan as a black male in its iconography just simply an honest mistake? As you can see, the claim should be rejected as utterly ridiculous by everyone on earth. Counter-reformationists will try to gaslight people when they see their explanations are not accepted. They will mock and insult people to deflect the public from the truth. But anyone who has eyes to see can see what they have done. And it is all very self-explanatory. They are lying now today, just as bad as they were lying then. And nothing has changed about their behavior. The Synagogue of Satan is another one of these fictitious Vatican myths, concocted to cover its very own tracks in history. If you believe the phrase, the Synagogue of Satan, refers to Jews, like Rapture Joe in the clip you just saw, then you have also been fooled by Rome's trick. And unfortunately this trick has resulted in the deaths of literally millions upon millions of Jews all over the world, and throughout the entire course of history. Rome knows what the text, the Synagogue of Satan, is actually referring to. But they, along with all the other anti-Semites that regularly cite it, not only hope, but count on the fact that you do not. So it is time you see what it really refers to for yourself. And in the process discover how you have been intentionally lied to as well. And don't think, for even a minute, it was not fully and completely intentional. It was deception of the very ugliest and very worst kind. But yes, you have been lied to. Because a careful examination of these texts will demonstrate this text actually has absolutely nothing to do with Jews. Nothing at all. The Vatican's propagandists have been intentionally lying with malicious intent ever since this text was written to hide what they know it means from the public. And you will discover why in what follows. Here are 7 facts by which you can know, beyond any doubt or debate, that this text actually does not and cannot refer to Jews. The first reason the Synagogue of Satan does not refer to the Synagogue of the Jews is that interpretation is not consistent with the rest of the New Testament. If that really were the teaching of the apostles, it would have been reflected in the New Testament as a whole. And not only do we find that the New Testament contradicts that claim, it does so in quite a dramatic fashion. The word synagogue is mentioned 40 times in the New Testament, outside of these 2 references in Revelation. You are now seeing these references on your screen. Each negative reference is marked with a red minus sign. Each neutral reference is marked with a gray 0. And each positive reference is marked with a green plus sign. As you can see on your screen, the positive mentions of the word synagogue vastly outweigh the negative references of the word. How much do the positive references outweigh the negative references? Here is the chart of all references to the word synagogue in the New Testament. As you can see, this result is completely inconsistent with the claim, the Synagogue of Satan refers to the Synagogue of the Jews. This should not be the case, if the claim were true. Secondly, if you actually look at the individual references, you will also notice that Christ grew up attending the synagogue every Sabbath. So that means Christ would have been raised and then a member of the Synagogue of Satan. And Paul himself went to synagogue every Sabbath. In both cases this was called their custom. But that's not all. Nearly all of the leadership of the New Testament community actually came from the synagogue, including the original disciples. So they too would have been members of the Synagogue of Satan. And most of the evangelism that took place in the New Testament was actually done in the synagogue. So most of all of the people mentioned in the New Testament would have also been members of the Synagogue of Satan, some of whom continued attending the Synagogue of Satan with Paul. So that means they were still satanic. But that's not all we discover in our survey. Thirdly, it will be noted that Jews are still called Jews, even when they reject both Christ and Paul. They might be called bad Jews, but they are still called Jews. Sometimes it is suggested they are not true Jews, in the spirit of what the word Jew is supposed to refer to, but they are still clearly called Jews. Even by Paul, who refers to them as blinded in Romans chapter 11. But Paul still calls them Jews. And point blank states that they still have a purpose in God's plan, even as unbelievers. so that information is also completely inconsistent with the interpretation that the phrase the Synagogue of Satan refers to Jews. Yes, after Messianic Jews became believers, they returned to worship practices in their homes as prescribed in the Torah, and Christ forbade the use of the title Rabbi among them, and you will see why when we get to chapter 17 and 18. While there were specific practices in the synagogue that Christ and the apostles were critical of, they never condemned the concept or the term synagogue as satanic. The fourth reason the Synagogue of Satan does not refer to the Synagogue of the Jews is because of the definition of the word synagogue. Because of how people interpret the Bible through ink-blot-free association, people will see two words, synagogue and Jews, and those two ink blots come to mean Jewish. But they don't actually pay any attention to what is being said about either. The word synagogue is from the Greek word synagoge, and simply means to assemble. Believers were still assembling or keeping synagogue in their homes. As you can see in the letter to the Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 10 verse 25 and the epistle of James in James chapter 2 verse 2, where they are even given instructions about doing it. They were assembling together with extended family and friends in their homes, and the term used here is literally the very same term translated synagogue in Revelation 2:9 and 3:9. Technically, the confusion about all this was created by translators when they stuck the word church in the New Testament to translate the word ecclesia. Whenever someone's church building is destroyed by God in a storm, the preacher will always remind the people that the church isn't the building, it is the people of God. But that's not really true. The word church actually does refer to the building, and not the ecclesia. And they will often tell people that they need to come to church. Well, if church is something you are, how do you go to it? Either you are the church and don't have to go anywhere, or you are not the church and need to go someplace other than where you are to be it. In the New Testament, ecclesia is what you were. Synagoge is what you did. The two words referred to two separate things. The knowledge of this original usage was lost to Christian audiences because of the anti-Semitic way in which these words were erroneously, but intentionally translated. If the word synagogue automatically means of Satan, then we would have to acknowledge James, the brother of Christ and the author of Hebrews, was telling people to be satanic. Because both were addressing Jewish audiences, and both were instructing them to keep synagogue, translated as the word assembly. The fifth reason the phrase Synagogue of Satan does not refer to the Synagogue of the Jews is that the apostles saw themselves as a reform movement within Judaism, as is openly stated in Hebrews chapter 9 verse 10. The synagogue needed to be reformed, but they never dreamed of calling it satanic. That would have impugned Christ himself. And that was something no apostle would have ever done. And while they were attempting to reform the practices of the synagogue, the apostles never condemned the synagogue itself. Why? Because most of the practices they continued to keep, such as baptism itself, elders, deacons, apostles, teachers, and even giving to the poor, all came from the synagogue. So if the synagogue itself were actually really satanic, so were all these practices. And Christ had even commanded his disciples to be respectful of the legal authority present in the seat of Moses within the synagogue, because in Israel before the destruction in 70 AD, this was part of the legal system in the country. It would have been the equivalent of not obeying a local court jurisdiction. And you just saw a few moments ago how the seat of Moses was the chair of legal authority in the synagogue. The same chair that the horned devil Moses is pictured sitting in the Vatican. So Christ, in essence, given this interpretation, would have been telling his disciples to submit to Satan. The sixth reason the phrase the Synagogue of Satan does not refer to the Synagogue of the Jews is that while most people who cite the phrase intend it to be taken as a reference to the Jewish synagogue, that is not what John actually says when he uses that phrase. John does not say it is a reference to the synagogue of the Jews. John says it is a reference to a synagogue that is not the Jews. Yes, they say they are Jews, but they are not. Instead, he points out that they are liars. And he does not mean that they are Jews who are not really Jews because they reject Christ. He means these people in the synagogue of Satan really are not Jews. They really are liars. They are Gentiles. It is a Gentile synagogue. Well, that's crazy, isn't it? What kind of synagogue would be a Gentile synagogue? Who would start such a thing? Especially at a time when Jews were being rounded up and imprisoned and exterminated? Actually, John has already told his readers who he is referring to as the Synagogue of Satan, who are not Jews, but Gentiles. And they are anti-Semitic. But most people will completely ignore his references to these other people, as though they are not even there in the text. He has already told you, they are the liars he is referring to. And the seventh reason the phrase, the Synagogue of Satan does not refer to the Synagogue of the Jews, is the big secret. The secret is that the Synagogue of Satan is not a synonym for the Synagogue of the Jews, it is an antonym. And there is a very big difference between a synonym and an antonym. They perform two different functions in grammar. One compares something to something else which is similar or the same in some way. The other, however, creates an opposite. A synonym is represented by an equal sign, but an antonym is represented by its opposite, a non-equal sign. They mean two entirely different things, linguistically. People think that John's reference to Jews, who say they are Jews, but are not, is a synonym for real historic Jews, who simply rejected Christ. But there is a major problem with that interpretation. The problem is they also read the word Satan in the phrase, but instead inconsistently take it as an antonym. But if Satan is an antonym, and Jews that are not Jews is a synonym, then you have the interpretation of a sentence that is completely self-contradictory. Either both references are synonyms, or both references are antonyms. But you can't have it both opposite ways in the same sentence. Because synonyms and antonyms are opposite usages of speech. The Vatican and its allies would rather you not know this phrase is an antonym to the phrase the Synagogue of the Jews. And you can see that if you put the two phrases up next to each other and compare the descriptions given to each in the surrounding textual material. The full exact and specific phrase, the Synagogue of the Jews, occurs exactly 3 times in the New Testament. The phrase, the Synagogue of Satan, appears twice. When we put these two phrases and their surrounding textual material side by side and match how they are described, we notice some very interesting things. First, the phrase the Synagogue of the Jews is described in Acts 17:4 as one. A great multitude believes. That doesn't sound satanic. Secondly, we notice the text says in verse 2, it was Paul's manner or custom to go. That's odd. That doesn't sound satanic. Thirdly, in verse 11, it says they received the word. Fourthly, in verse 11 it says they studied the scriptures daily. Wow. That really sounds satanic, doesn't it? And in verse 6, it says many leaders believed, and that they were honorable. None of that sounds satanic at all. But when we get to the second column of texts, we find why the terms are antonyms. First, we notice they are called intentional liars. In other words, they have embraced lying as part of their religious practice, which is obviously not honorable or noble at all. Secondly, we note that they are named after Nicholas. Nicholas was a Gentile convert in the book of Acts, which we have already covered, who went apostate and founded a rival religious movement called Nicolaitanism in the New Testament. And as you have already seen, it received the sponsorship of the Roman government. Nicholas was supposed to be a convert to Judaism, but regressed and went back to being Gentile. Historically speaking, that usually meant practicing idolatry and a variety of forms of immorality, including either or prostitution and or pedophilia. So while he claimed to be a Jew, he was not. He was a liar. Which brings us to the third description. They say they are Jews, but are not, but do lie. That would be true. The Nicolaitans were prolific religious liars. And actually they still are. They have actually institutionalized their celebration of religious deception in the veneration of their patron saint. The first location John gives of the two mentions of the Synagogue of Satan is the city of Pergamos. This brings us to the sixth point that demonstrates John is describing the Nicolaitans and not the Synagogue of the Jews, because John very clearly connects this movement to the city of Pergamos. How does he do that? Because the Synagogue of Satan is not the only thing of Satan he actually mentions. If you will notice in chapter 2 beginning in verse 12 and 13, John writes, quote, "And to the messenger of the ecclesia in Pergamos write, I know thy works, and where thou dwellest, even where Satan's seat is, and thou holdest fast my name, and hast not denied my faith, even in those days wherein Antipas was my faithful martyr, who was slain among you, where Satan dwelleth." End quote. In the preceding text, John writes that Satan's seat was in the city of Pergamos, and also that is where Satan dwelled. There was a synagogue of Satan mentioned in the city of Smyrna, and a synagogue of Satan mentioned in the city of Philadelphia. But the actual seat of Satan and where Satan dwelled was said to be in Pergamos. It's pretty hard to have a synagogue of Satan and not connect it to Satan's seat and where Satan dwells. If you have a synagogue of Satan that is not connected to the seat of Satan or where Satan dwells, then there's not much left about it that is satanic. These texts are obviously connected to each other, and John was pointing out the source of what was happening in the city of Smyrna and in the city of Philadelphia had its origin in the city of Pergamos. Well, what was in Pergamos? According to the text itself, that is where the Nicolaitans were. Why was it said that they claimed to be Jews but weren't? Because they were following the Gentile apostate Nicholas, and they were rejecting the Passover meal commanded by Christ, which he called his flesh. They were denying his flesh in the Passover meal, as John has already pointed out in chapter 2 verses 4 through 6. It's kind of hard to claim to be a Jewish apostle, and not even be Jewish, yet that is precisely what the Nicolaitans were doing. That is why John dismissed them altogether as liars. Not only did they lie about being apostles, they even lied about being Jewish. Neither of which they really were. So you see, the actual synagogue or assembly of Satan, historically, was actually the assembly of the Nicolaitans, which were spreading among the 7 cities to which John was writing. And they were spreading their influence out of the city of Pergamos, where John identifies them by name. Pergamos had the largest temple in the entire world, dedicated to Zeus, who was the father of Apollo. This is the same Apollo John identified as the actual king of the Antichrist in Revelation chapter 9 verse 11. And thus why he also identified the city of Pergamos as the location of Satan's throne. The synagogue or assembly of Satan was directly connected to the seat of Satan and the dwelling of Satan out of the city of Pergamos. It was a Gentile institution in nature and not Jewish. It falsely claimed to be both apostolic and Jewish, which John says in reality was neither, and was based on the habitual practice of intentional deceit. It was an antonym of the phrase, the synagogue of the Jews. Not a synonym. It was in fact a direct opposite to apostolic Reform Judaism. It wasn't Jewish at all. Ironically, even today, the modern theological descendants of the Nicolaitans still claim to be Jewish, but are not. The Roman Church, with all of its wild and extreme deviancies and prolific expressions of anti-Semitism from the apostolic tradition, still to this day, claim to be the real Jews of the Bible, while they still openly deny the flesh of Christ in the Passover meal. They actually and arrogantly claim ownership and authorship of the entire Bible. They claim they actually wrote the book of Revelation itself. And they claim the content of all its pages are about them alone. The popes still wear a Jewish kippah or yarmulke, although today, the Vatican tells people, the pope wears his kippah simply to keep his head warm, and nothing else. But anyone who is honest can see that is a lie. There are many alternate ways to keep your head warm, other than wearing a religious garment, uniquely prescribed by Jewish rabbinicalism, in the Jewish Talmud. They say they are Jews, but are not. That was a perfect description of the Nicolaitans, still even today nearly 2,000 years later. They say they are Jews, but are not, and do lie. This is what the translation of the Greek word, synagogue, into synagogue rather than assembly, and the depictions of the horned Moses, in Rome's iconography, was all intended to hide. And it did a very good job of hiding it, even into our modern day, where we still hear citations of the phrase, the synagogue of Satan, by modern-day Nicolaitans. To damn and curse the very synagogue of the Jews, of which even Christ himself and all his original followers had been not only members of, but dedicated reformers to. And still to this very day, the Nicolaitans are still Antichrist, denying the flesh of Christ in the Passover meal, saying they are Jews, but are not, and do lie. Just as John wrote about them 2,000 years ago. This brings us to our second topic concerning the year 1890 AD, dealing with the fulfillment of prophecy in history. The second topic is Zionism. Our reconstructed text for verse 15 reads, quote, "The seventh messenger sounded, and there were great sounds in the sky saying, Come into being, the royal order of our Lord and his anointed, and he shall rule from ages to ages." End quote. This text prophesies that God will speak the royal order of the Messiah into existence, and as a result of this royal order coming into existence, Christ will rule from ages to ages. As mentioned earlier, chapter 11 begins with a prophecy that Jerusalem will be taken away from the Jews. But in verse 15, marked for the year 1890, a new order is being called forth, that will result in Jerusalem being returned to the Jews. And then in verse 18, because of this, the Gentile Empire which lost Jerusalem, would become angry. So what happened in the year 1890 AD? As you see here in the article from the Jerusalem Post, it was in this very year of 1890, as the article says, in the wake of the Reformation, that the term Zionism was coined. Zionism is defined in an article, by History.com, as quote, "a religious and political effort that brought thousands of Jews from around the world back to their ancient homeland in the Middle East, and re-established Israel as the central location for Jewish identity." The article goes on to state quote, "The name comes from the word Zion, which is a Hebrew term that refers to Jerusalem." End quote. This occurred in the year 1890 AD, precisely as we see marked on John's historical timeline for that very year. Exactly 7 years later, the first Zionism World Congress was held in Basel, Switzerland, and was the formation of a Jewish government for the land of Israel. Precisely as had been prophesied by John, nearly 2,000 years ago. And John prophesies that it is the work of the Messiah, and for his rule. Which is a very interesting historical note about the creation of the nation of Israel. The state is called the Royal Order of the Messiah, in John's prophecy, and it is for him that it is created. There are many rabbis who want you to know they had nothing to do with restoring the nation of Israel. They are both historically and theologically correct. Rabbis had little to nothing to do with the creation of the state of Israel. And that fact will come back to haunt them in the future. They also want you to know that the nation of Israel can't possibly be restored, because that would mean that the Messiah has already come. Because for hundreds of years, rabbis have been correctly teaching that only the Messiah could, and would, restore the land of Israel. And its restoration would be a sign to the world, the Jewish Messiah had come. So obviously, if it is restored, that means the Messiah has already come. The existence of the state of Israel, which is called the center of Jewish identity, is actually physical proof that the Messiah indeed has already come. No Jew on earth can point to the physical existence of the state of Israel, which they are today so proud of, without also being reminded it is the result of a Messiah that has already come. If you pull out a map of the world and see a state of Israel on it, it is because a Jewish Messiah has already come. But the problem is, rabbis cannot teach that. Even though they are also the ones in charge of Israel religiously right now, and they are the very ones benefiting from its restoration. So it is quite a confusing time for rabbis. And because the nation of Israel has been created by the command of God for the Messiah, it also means the Messiah who has already come and did restore the nation into existence will play a future role in what happens to this nation, as you will see in the chapters to come in John's prophecies. The next year that is identified on John's astronomically dated historical timeline in reference to the seventh trumpet judgment and the restoration of the nation of Israel will be the year 1918. What happened in the year 1918? There was a small war, perhaps you have heard of it, called World War I, which ended exactly in the year 1918. And this will not be John's only reference to this war. But within literally days of the year 1918, in December of 1917, Jerusalem, previously held by the Ottoman Turk Empire for 400 years, fell to the British. Posters for Hanukkah that year displayed an illustration of the British General Edmund Allenby, alongside Judah Maccabee's liberation of Jerusalem, against the Syrian occupation of Antiochus Epiphanes. Approximately 1 month earlier, the Balfour Declaration was issued by the British government, pledging its support for a Jewish homeland in the Middle East. And once again, what are the odds that all these events would fall precisely as they did on John's astronomically dated timeline? The next major event in John's astronomically dated, historical timeline, 28.3 years later once again, is the year 1947. What happened in the year 1947? Just 2 years earlier, another little war had just ended with the surrender of Germany and Japan to the Allied forces. This one was called World War II. The empires that lost the First World War wanted a rematch, and so came World War II. For a second dose of misery and destruction. This one ended the same way the last one did, with the Allies defeating the Axis powers, whose goal was to restore the Roman Empire, along with its rule over Jerusalem. It was destined to fail, as it did. But in the process, Adolf Hitler decided to finish off the Jews, which, because he was Roman Catholic, believed them to be a race of Caucasian Eastern Europeans, known today as Ashkenazi Jews. Among these Jewish peoples, he committed 6 million to the gas chambers and cremation ovens during his rule. But, instead of exterminating them, however, he incentivized the whole world, including the American president, Harry Truman, to officially grant them asylum to a homeland in Palestine. In the exact year of 1947, Britain withdrew from the Palestine Mandate, and in the following year of 1948, the sovereign state of Israel was born. Afterwards, tens of thousands of Ashkenazi Jews from all over Europe migrated to Israel as their new homeland. In the following year of 1949, the nation of Israel was accepted into the United Nations as the 59th nation to be recognized. And John's prophecy, written from an ancient Roman prison nearly 2,000 years ago, that Jerusalem would be returned to the Jews, was now fulfilled. The next marker on John's astronomically dated, historical timeline, is the year 1975, and the anger of the Gentiles over the loss of Jerusalem. It is this response of anger and violence that provokes the wrath of God, in the final seventh trumpet judgment. What was happening during this period in history? 1975 was the year Islamic terrorism began to take off as both a practice, and an ideology, among Hadith Muslims, worldwide. Not all Muslims are Hadith Muslims, but Hadith Muslims make up a majority of Islam in the same way that Catholicism makes up a majority of Christianity. Hadith Muslims have been historically very connected to the Vatican and were its allies in World War II. They believe in a volume of over 500,000 hadiths, which are oral traditions, and legal opinions, which they believe supersede the Quran. In the same way that the Catholic Church supersedes the writings of the apostles in the Bible, with their own oral traditions. Quranists, which are the equivalent to the Protestant reformers in Islam, are a persecuted minority in the Islamic community, and believe the arbitrary and man-made hadiths are the real source of all the conflict between Sunni and Shia Muslims, extreme anti-Semitism, violence, and regressive oppression of women in the Muslim world. Quranic Muslims are actually the only real Muslims left in the modern world, because they are the only ones who actually accept their own Quran. But in most Shia and Sunni countries, they are hated and persecuted, legally and socially, sometimes even worse than Jews. Yet these are the only original real Muslims left in the world. And they are a tiny minority. During World War II, Hitler infiltrated the Shia Muslim community through the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, and the Sunni Muslim community through the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. They both sponsored the propagation of an extremely anti-Semitic Islamic theology, based upon new, non-historical interpretations of their hadiths, designed to integrate Shia and Sunni Muslim thought with Hitler's Nazi Party in Germany. Meanwhile, back in Germany, Hitler was busy actually exterminating Muslims in his gas chambers, right along with his crusade against Caucasian Europeans who practiced rabbinical Judaism. After World War II, the Nazification of Hadith-based Islamic theology continued to spread in Shia and Sunni Islamic countries throughout the world. The Irish Republican Army, a Vatican-sponsored terrorist group, which fought against the Allies in both World War I and World War II, soon after the Second World War, exported their Nazi-inspired tactics and beliefs to the Middle East, where it birthed what people know today as Islamic terrorism, which in reality is not Islamic at all. It borrowed the idea of the sacred suicide bomber from Japan's kamikaze pilots, who were Buddhists, from World War II. Suicide itself is actually damned to hell in the Quran, as is killing non-combatant civilians. But this Nazification of Hadith Islam, incited, funded and trained for terrorism by the IRA, would soon be the only kind of Islam the Western world would soon know anything about. People who were born after 1969 think that the world has always been full of Islamic terrorism because that is the only kind of world they have known. But modern terrorism as it is today, among Muslims, did not become a new normal until after 1969. In 1969, the PLO elected Yasser Arafat to be its chairman, whom many historians consider to be the father of modern Islamic terrorism. In the year 1974, after several successful terrorist operations, Yasser Arafat is granted an audience with the United Nations. In response to his threats of violence against the world, the United Nations grants his request to recognize Palestinians the right to sovereignty and national independence, many thinking that pacifying his demands would lead to peace. Instead, it threw a match on the gasoline can of Islamic terrorism. Arafat was lauded as a hero, and Islamic terrorism became the new way to achieve any desired political end in the Muslim world. Terrorism became so popular in the Muslim world that soon Muslims were now even killing Muslims over various grievances. And it is no accident that white supremacy terrorism, IRA terrorism, and Islamic terrorism often collaborate with each other in their violence, because they share exactly the same roots with each other in theological history, all going back not to Christianity or even Islam, but to the Roman Empire, or the Reich as Hitler called it, all through the Vatican in Rome. To learn more about how Islamic terrorism actually had its roots in Nazi Germany and the Irish Republican Army, you can watch the series on this channel entitled Terrorism and New World Order Disinformation. A link to this series is posted in the description section below this video. The year 1975 was a busy year for terrorism, as you can see on the scroll on your screen. But as you will also note, terrorism is still the main venue of Vatican-sponsored groups such as the Irish Republican Army, with the two exceptions of the PLO actions against the State of Israel, one of which was the highly symbolic bombing of Zion Square in which 14 were killed and 80 injured, including the Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs. This massacre was a landmark event in the history of Islamic terrorism. After 1975, Islamic terrorism blossomed into a rampage of violence that would eventually fill the world with barbaric acts of indiscriminate mutilations, victimizing even other Muslims, who would soon find themselves being blown up at their own mosques during prayer. The Nazification of Hadith Islam was a curse that would be set loose upon the whole world, killing, maiming and injuring thousands of men, women and children from every religion and every corner of the globe. And one of the largest concentrations of Islamic terrorism would not be in the Middle East as many people would imagine, but it would be found in the largest concentration of Muslim populations in the world, the country of Indonesia. Indonesia had one of the world's largest veteran populations of the Afghanistan war, fighting in defense of the Taliban after 9/11. These veterans returned to Indonesia with jihadist beliefs in the use of terrorism and violence as a means for political gain, and soon after began proliferating their violent ideology and activity to the rest of the world. Little did they know, however, their violent Nazi ideology was actually fighting against God. When we come to verse 19, we are coming to the final part of the prophecy concerning the restoration of Israel to the Jews, and that is God's response to the Gentiles, who have been collaborating with, and following the Antichrist, and are now angry over their loss of Jerusalem. As mentioned previously, the seven-trumpet motif was taken from the Old Testament episode where trumpets were blown around Jericho 7 times, and the walls came down as the result of an earthquake. John's use of this symbolism, to describe God's ultimate victory over the Antichrist, in returning Jerusalem to the Jews, culminates in the completion of the 7th trumpet in this verse. There are several signs given in the verse that mark the occurrence of this event on the historical timeline, that make its identification unmistakable. First, there is going to be a significant meteor shower, heralding the coming of the event. There is going to be an increase in lightning, storms and large hail, and to top everything else off, just before the earthquake and flood occurs, the Ark of His Testament will actually be seen in the sky. So, did these things actually happen in real history, and if so, how? We will go down the list, with each item. We will begin with the meteorological descriptions first. These are the descriptions that cite changes in the weather. Obviously, if this were all made up, there is no way we could get nature to cooperate with our imaginary scheme of prophecy. So let's see if these things really did happen. If they did, then it is continuing evidence that John's astronomical dating is real, and is in the text precisely as we are looking at it. And it is also evidence that Christmas really is the season of the dead, because it is the worship of the image of the beast, and the papacy really is the prophesied biblical Antichrist, precisely as all the reformers in history for 400 years had said it was. First, there is the prophecy about an increase in lightning. Because record-keeping for lightning strikes has only recently begun, there is no historical baseline to verify whether there has been an increase in lightning strikes. But climate scientists have consistently warned that global warming will lead to an increase in lightning. And that projection is not without existing statistical evidence already. Lightning is produced in the atmosphere by the very same meteorological conditions that produce storms. You get lightning when you have a thunderstorm. When there is no storm, you usually do not have any lightning, because lightning is usually produced by a storm. And we do have historical records for storm occurrences. In this article on your screen, you can see that it is documented that global warming has increased both the frequency and intensity of destructive storms. This phenomena is now well documented, and is not controversial. And with more storms, also comes more lightning. In fact, here is a chart of the storm trend over several decades. And as you can see from the chart, there was a significant surge in storm activity right around the time frame of this prophetic event. In 2005, which is the next subsequent year, which began on our historical timeline only 5 days later after this event, there were a record-breaking 28 named storms in that year. You can see the peak there on the chart. So this prophecy was definitely fulfilled precisely as John had prophesied. In fact, in the state of Florida, in the very year of 2004, a weather incident occurred that had never happened before or since, in recorded history. Within just the space of 6 weeks, Florida experienced 4 major named hurricanes, 3 of which crossed over the same exact single spot, in the center of the state. The next thing we come to is the issue of hail. Storms indicated by use of the word thunders, also indicated by reference to the word lightning, were both fulfilled. But what about John's prophecy concerning the occurrence of great hail? Ironically, the same meteorological conditions that produced thunders and lightning in the form of storms, are the same conditions that produce an increase in the frequency and size of hail, which also occurred precisely as John prophesied. Here is an article documenting the increase in hail size. It is entitled "Costly Hailstorms Are Rapidly Increasing." This next article is an article explaining the increase in hail size is being caused by global warming. Here is a chart showing the increasing size of hail over an 8-year span, from 2010 to 2018, but at the top makes the observation that, quote, between 2000 and 2017, about 8.8% of U.S. severe hail reports included hail that was larger than 2.2 inches in diameter. End quote. The trend began showing up significantly, beginning in the year 2000. So we see John's prophecy concerning increasing hail has also been fulfilled. Next we will look at the astronomical signs prophesied to accompany this event in history, and we will see if these two occurred as John had prophesied them. First, we have the mention of the meteor shower mentioned in verse 16, that will occur prior to the earthquake event in verse 19. Because John has time-framed the earthquake event in December by making a reference to the season of the dead, which is the Christmas season, we can look for this meteor shower event in December of 2004. So was there a meteor shower that matches John's description in the sky in December 2004? As a matter of fact, there actually was. It was the Geminids meteor shower which occurred on December 13th of that very year. Physics.org describes it as the best meteor shower of the year for 2004. Someone might say, well, that's no big deal, the Geminid meteor showers occur every year, they're an annual event, so what? Well, you have to remember when this was prophesied. John prophesied this meteor shower nearly 2,000 years ago, to December 2004. When we are born into the world, we often think of the world as always having been the same way it is right now. Which these prophetic changes that John is prophesying are happening over the span of lifetimes. In John's day, there were no such thing as Geminid meteor showers. And here is the most amazing thing of all. When you research when the Geminid meteor showers first appear in history, this is what you will discover. Their first occurrence, ever in the history of humanity, was precisely and exactly in the year 1862, just before the Civil War. As you just saw, the first marker on the historical timeline for the seventh trumpet is exactly the same year of 1862. This is the same time frame in history that Union soldiers were marching into the Battle of Antietam, singing about the seventh trumpet being sounded, that never retreats. What are the odds of that? As you can see, there are too many synchronistic random variables that are lining up perfectly on the historical timeline to be just a mere lucky accident. 1862, the first marker for the seventh trumpet in history, is the beginning of the Geminid meteor showers in history. The same Geminid showers that will now herald on December 13th, the coming of the great earthquake, prophesied by John, completing the seventh trumpet. This article from NASA shows how the Geminid meteor shower comes out of the mouth of the two witnesses of Gemini, and radiate in a multilateral direction. Thus also, being like the 24 elders around the throne, falling to the ground. And now the last part of John's astronomical description, that of the Ark of the Testament, also being seen in the sky. This prophecy is a pretty tall order because there was no constellation of record in the ancient world, in John's day, associated with the Ark of the Covenant. And it is pretty clear in John's language, that he is prophesying something in the sky, in his own day, which does not yet exist. But then it does. So it would have to be a new constellation or astronomical event that was not present in John's day, but is now, just like the Geminids meteor shower. But what is it? And how do we know what it is? Sometimes the answers are so obvious, they literally cannot be missed, even if you intentionally try to miss them. And sometimes, when things are hiding in such obvious plain view, those are also the very things that are the hardest to see. Because you see them all the time, and you have learned to pay no attention to them. Two clues are found in John's language, that being the Ark, which is a box, and then he adds of the Testament. When the King James translation thought the text was referring to something having to do with the New Testament or New Covenant under Christ, they would use the word Testament. But when they thought it referred to the Levitical covenant under Moses, they would use the phrase covenant, instead of testament. But they were doing that with the same Greek word, just like they did with Joshua and Jesus. So we don't really know if that text refers to a box, or a cross. A cross would be testament, a box would be covenant. But the Greek word is the same for both. On the Ark of the Covenant, there was something called the mercy seat, where blood was poured out once a year at Yom Kippur, for the sins of the nation. This is a precursor of the atonement in Christ. So which is it, a box or a cross? Trying to find an answer to this question is impossible because the words are the same. But, what if it is both? Both a box and a cross? So the criteria presented by the text would be a constellation that did not exist in John's day, but subsequent to John's day, it came into being. First as a box, then a cross. Just like the terms are used in the scripture, first a box, then a cross. What would be the odds of that? That would be very unlikely, to simply match a random event. As would be expected, when we look into history, we find just such a constellation. It looks exactly like a rectangular box at a 15 to 25 degree angle in the sky. Thus John's reference to it is the Ark, a word which means box. But after the Reformation, no one really knows how or originally by who, this box constellation received a new name. The name was the Latin word, crux. Crux, as it sounds, means cross. Some reference materials will mention the source of the name as the French mapper, Augustin Royer in 1679. But actually it first appeared in 1598, as a constellation in a constellation map created by Petrus Plancius, a Protestant minister, who had immigrated to Holland to escape the Inquisition. Suddenly and quietly, out of nowhere, the mysterious box in the sky became a cross. Just as the Ark, in the Bible itself, went from a box to a cross. Somewhere along the way, the Latin name crux was replaced with a more English convention, the Southern Cross. American astronomer Elijah Hinsdale Burt, from New England, Connecticut, popularized this name in his work, Geography of the Heavens, which sold out several times, and was used as a textbook reference in public schools. The book was reprinted in 6 editions, all of which sold out. After his death, it was also expanded and revised by astronomer Hiram Madison, and republished in 1876, which sold out 9 editions. His first edition was published in 1835, the very year following the earthquake in Jerusalem. The Southern Cross or crux was not known in John's time. It was seen as part of the constellation Centaurus. But astronomers noted that because of precession, it was last visible in Jerusalem around the time of Christ's crucifixion, and then disappeared from the skies of Jerusalem, although it still remained visible in southern Europe. Ironically, after the Edict of Thessalonica, in 380 AD, astronomical sources say it was never seen again, in the northern hemisphere, after 400 AD, only 20 years later. How incredibly weird is that? First it disappears from the skies of Jerusalem, after the crucifixion of Christ, then it disappears from the skies of Europe, after the prophetic Edict of Thessalonica, prophesied by Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. But if all this were simply imaginary, or just made up, just picking out a constellation that matches this description is not enough. Even if you can manage to actually find something that matches John's unlikely description, what are the odds it will be seen in the sky, right before the event of December 2004, in the exact location the event is going to occur? There are way too many things that have to all line up accidentally, for this to work, if it is the result of someone's imagination. It is just not possible. But as impossible as it may be, the Southern Cross was actually seen on the southern horizon of Indonesia, just before sunrise, only hours before, on the day of the actual event, which we will now look at. The following is the fulfillment of Revelation chapter 11 verses 14 through 19, as the 7th trumpet, in history.